Welcome to one of the more colorful alleys here in Denver, and we are going to talk about portraits. Now we're just going to cover a few things, mostly location selection, gear selection, settings, and just how to work with your model. I've got the lovely Lola here today, and we are going to work together to show you how to create beautiful portraits. When you're creating a portrait, it's going to be of a person, so the person is a given, but where you photograph that person is actually going to be very important to the image as well. Now maybe it's in a colorful, fun alley like this and you're just looking for something that's fun and entertaining to look at. Maybe it's a headshot and you don't want all this color behind you. You want just a simple, nice, neutral background. Maybe it's of a family member in your home. That's a very meaningful place for a lot of people. Wherever it is, location selection is important. How I came up with this is really, we're not looking for a very formal picture. We don't have any real purpose. We just wanted some color, something a little fun. This alley really fits the bill for that. The next thing you're going to need to create this portrait is a camera. Now here I've got a Nikon D5500. It's a crop sensor. I've also got a 35mm lens on it, which is the equivalent field of view of a 50mm lens. Personally, I really prefer an 85mm lens on a full frame sensor, but really 50 and 85mm are the two popular focal lengths for portraits. Now why is that? If you use a really wide angle lens, say an 18mm, 20mm, 24mm, you're going to be very close to your subject, and that's actually going to introduce some distortion. When you have a longer focal length, you're going to have to step back from your subject, and you're going to create a portrait that doesn't have as much distortion and is therefore more flattering. So consider right now, I'm going to be shooting with a 50mm equivalent field of view lens. I'm also going to use an 85mm in a little bit, and I'll show you what we get. The settings that you choose are very important to the final look of your image. Now, I'm shooting with prime lenses, which means I can shoot down to f1.4 if I want to. I'm probably not going to do that today, just so that we have a little more detail in the background, so that I don't have to worry about that super shallow depth of field. Likely I'll be shooting at f2, maybe f2.8, depending on how the final image looks. So, once you have your aperture decided, that is pretty much going to be fixed. And then we know from the exposure triangle, the other two variables that we have to control the final look and exposure of the image are going to be our shutter speed and our ISO. If you're shooting outside in daylight, there's really no reason that you need to shoot at a high ISO. So you can always shoot at a high shutter speed, keep that ISO low, probably 100, 200, maybe 400 if it's a little overcast, if it's getting towards sunset and there's not that much light. But keep your ISO low, keep your shutter speed higher, or at least as high as it needs to be, and then you can have that fixed aperture to have a really consistent look for all of your images. Now there's two more settings that you might want to consider when you're taking portraits. The first one is metering. Now personally I use a spot metering, which lets me just meter off of one specific portion of my frame and not have to worry about what the background looks like, what the clothes look like. All I do is I meter off of someone's forehead, get the correct exposure, and then I know that at least my subject is going to be properly exposed. Now the background might be blown out, it might be underexposed, that's an issue, but the most important thing is going to be to have a properly exposed subject. The next setting you'll want to consider is your focus mode. Now I just use a single focus point, and that's just going to be in single servo mode. Now what that allows me to do is just focus on one specific part of my subject, and it's always going to be the eye that's closest to the camera. When a subject's moving, I switch over to a continuous mode, but we don't have a moving subject today, so we don't really have to worry about that. Ultimately, just experiment with the different modes. For everyone, it's going to be different on what works best for you. But for me, it's just going to be one single focus point. It's going to be single servo mode, and I'm always going to focus on my subject's closest eye. Now, there's plenty of other settings on your camera that you could change, but they're going to be just general to photography and your personal preference. For example, there's RAW versus JPEG. I always shoot in RAW. I just have more information to work with, and if I need to change something after the fact, I don't have to nail it in camera. Also, white balance. I shoot with a fixed white balance, but you might shoot auto if you don't know exactly what the white balance is, or if you are just in a situation with tricky lighting, let the camera make the decision for you. So now that we have our subject, we have our location, we have our gear, we have our settings, the next most important thing is going to be light. Now without light, there are no photographs. So light is very important, and it really can contribute to the final look and feel of an image. So how do we work with the light we have today? Right now we have really soft light to work with. There's a bunch of clouds that are in front of the sun, and that really diffuses all the light that's coming down so we don't get those harsh shadows that are really intense and just not very flattering. So how do we work with this soft diffused light? Well, the first thing you'll want to notice, the sun is over in this general direction. So we still have a directionality to the light, and you can probably see this side of my face and Lola's face is going to be a little bit brighter than this side. So we still have some definition. It's not completely flat light, and that's important. We're still going to have shadows and definition and things like that to work with. So just recognizing where the sun is in relation to your subject is the first step in choosing good light. Now, one trap a lot of people fall into is placing a priority on the background over the light. You might, you'll hear it all the time. People will say, oh, look at that city, like that's a great background, or look at that mountain, let's put that in the background of our photo. But the light is just not flattering if you face someone so that the mountain or the city or whatever is behind them. And the same can happen in an alley with a wall. If this wall is my priority over my subject and over the light, then just take a picture of the wall. But if you want to take a good picture of a person, you have to pay attention to the light, and you have to pay attention to what direction they're facing. You can try your best to put them in front of an interesting background, and you should, but don't get so fixated on one background that you sacrifice the subject and you sacrifice the light just to have that background in the image. Okay, so now I have Lola where I want her for the portrait. I've kind of looked at the background. There's a door over there that I don't want to be in the frame. There's a post. So I've got her far enough down this wall that if I shoot at a bit of an angle, those aren't going to show up. Now, the next thing is the light. So I'm going to have her face kind of over this way. And what that does, the sun is up here. It's going to be coming down here, and you can probably see, well, you can see definitely some shadows from my hand on her face, but they're really, really light. They're really diffused. So we know that the shadows and the light are not going to be very intense, but they're still there. So you can see like just under her chin a little bit, there's a bit of shadow. Under her nose a little, there's some shadow. That's good. That gives some definition to her face. But if we have her look straight ahead, they're going to be kind of cutting across her face. So if I have her turn, which I will, it's going to be towards the light. So we have a lot more even lighting. We don't have a lot of shadows on her face, under her chin, and it's going to be a very pretty portrait. Now I'm ready to make this portrait, and the first thing that I'm going to work on with Lola is the pose. So what I don't want her shoulders to be square to the camera, because that is really the widest part of your body. So anytime I work with someone, I'm always going to have them turn just a little bit of an angle so that they're not completely square to the camera. So like this. So Lola, go ahead and stand. Yes, that's perfect. So right now her shoulders are not square. They're actually kind of tilted away from the camera. Same with her hips. It's like this plane right here. And then her face turns towards the camera. So another thing you'll want to do is give specific directions. It's really easy to know what you have in your head, but the person you're photographing has no idea what you're talking about. So if you just say, oh, turn, they might just do this, or you don't know what's going to happen. So give very specific directions. So let's work on this a little bit. So Lola, you are angled really well right now. Go ahead and turn your shoulders a bit this way towards me. Sorry, there you go, perfect. I like how her hands are. They're kind of like hooked in her pockets. That looks really good. It separates the arms from the body a little bit, gives a little attitude, lets the shoulders like drop a bit, looking really good. Now that I've got her body situated, I want to make sure I work on how her head is positioned a little bit. So again, specific directions. I probably, even though her body is facing away from the camera, I definitely want her face towards the camera. So let me have you go ahead and look just a little bit over my shoulder, maybe at that telephone pole right there. And again, specific directions are nice, so she knows exactly where I want her to look. So go ahead and look at that pole. Shoulders open. Okay, I'm liking this. Let's go ahead and take a quick shot here. So I'm gonna have you just look over my shoulder. Just think some happy thoughts. Like I said, think about your boys. Okay, and let me have one, just your eyes right here to me. Just right in the camera. All right, so we just took a few photos here, and to be quite honest, it takes a little bit of time to warm up and break into a portrait session. You're not gonna get your best work in the first 5 photos. You'll want to shoot some, you want to develop a bit of a rapport, you're going to walk around, find some new locations, find different light. You want to play with it and you want to give it some time. But just so you can see what we've got, we're going to show you the photo real quick. Take a look, see what you think. Now just to change things up and see if I could get something a little bit different, I'm going to change my aperture from 2.8 to 1.4, and let's see if we can get something that's a little bit more interesting. So Lola, you're looking good there. Go ahead and hook your thumbs. Let's do it in your back pocket this time. Okay, and let me get this aperture changed here. That looks very good. Means I've also got to change my shutter speed. Okay, and I want you to just kind of like look right over my head, chin up. There we go. That looks really nice. Open your shoulders back towards me just so, there we go, just like that. And pop your right elbow out just a little. There we go. That's very nice. Let me have you look just straight down this alley, kind of at that dumpster. Oh, that's wonderful. And I want you to think some just a little bit happier thoughts. Think about your boys a little bit more. Hope they're not tearing up the house right now. You can smile, it's okay. And just look right at me. There we go. Perfect. Okay. So that's going to be a little bit different image just because I've got that wider aperture. I've got a softer background now. There's still definite detail in the background because it's such a bold graphic, but it's just not quite as defined as it was before. I've just switched to my preferred portrait setup, which is an 85mm lens on a full frame body. Let's see what the difference is. So, Lola, looking good. Let me go ahead and have you stagger your feet a little bit. Okay. Go ahead and hook those thumbs. And let me just have you look just a little bit past me here. Stand up nice and straight. Okay, excellent. Very nice. I like that. Go ahead, drop this shoulder just a little bit towards me. There. And just eyes right to me. And maybe brush that little bit of hair out. Perfect. Okay, and let's get one more. Let me have you just kind of look down at the ground. And just bring your eyes right up to me. Very nice. Excellent. Good. Let's see how those look. Looking great. Now, one of the main reasons I love this setup is it really allows me to focus on my subject and not so much on the background. I mean, right now we're standing in an alley. There's trash, there's a dumpster, there's like cars, there's all kinds of stuff. But with this, all we see is Lola and a nice, subtle, soft background, and that's about it. If I'm shooting with the 35, you're gonna see that dumpster, you're gonna see those cars, you're gonna see all this environment, and that's okay, if that's what you're going for. But personally, I really like to just focus on my subject, make them pop out of the image, have a nice soft background, and forget that we're in an alley. So, let's just have some fun, take some photos, go make some great portraits.
All right, we're in San Francisco downtown, and we're here doing a night shot cityscape of downtown area, and you can see it's really, really pretty here. I apologize for the light here. We didn't bring any lighting with us, so I look kind of yellow and there's a lot of nasty shadows. But that's not the point. I want to show you what I'm trying to do here and the type of the gear that I have with me and the settings that I'm using to capture the scene. So before I talk about the exposure and what I'm trying to do here, let me first go over the gear. Right here I've got my Gizzo Traveler. It's a really nice tripod, but as you can see I've got the center column extended. I did this for composition purposes. I just wanted to frame the shot exactly how I want it. I usually don't do this because with tripods, whenever you use the center column, instead of 3 points, now you have 1 point. So there's a lot more possibility for shake. But the reason why I'm doing this is because I'm using a mirrorless camera. This is a Sony a7 II, and the nice thing about this camera is that it has a mode called electronic front curtain shutter. And what that allows me to do is allows me to actually set this camera on a timer, and I start the exposure, and at the beginning of the exposure, the shutter doesn't vibrate, it doesn't go up. So that allows me to start it, and I can just move, have the camera start the capture of the scene, and then after 15-20 seconds, however long my exposure is, then the shutter comes down at the end to end the exposure. So if you're doing this with a DSLR, actually some of the newer DSLRs like the Nikon D810 has the ability to do the same thing. It's a really nice thing, you just have to be in the right mode. So with the D810, you just have to be in the mirror lockup mode and use a remote shutter release. Now, let me talk about what I'm trying to do here with the camera. As you can see, the camera is set up vertically. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I don't want to capture these buildings in the foreground. I want to focus on the distant cityscape. It looks really, really nice. And I want to capture the tall buildings in the back and maybe have a little bit of the foreground. So right here I've got the 2470 Zeiss, Sony Zeiss lens. It's a really nice lens. And I set it to around 50 millimeters. Now, before I go into exposure, let me just show you what I'm trying to do here with the composition. So whenever I set up a camera, the first thing that I do is framing. I want to make sure that my framing looks good, that the overall image is going to look good before I start messing with all the camera settings. So I set it up, I framed it the way I want, and as you can see in the resulting image, the way that I composed this is I put that tall pyramid building to the left, about 1/3 of the frame to the left, and then I've got another building on the right which I also played about 1/3 into the frame. If you look at the bottom, this street becomes my leading line. So I'm thinking about all this stuff as I compose my shot, and this is my composition for this particular scene. All right, now let's talk about camera settings. What I'm doing here is I want to make sure that my exposure is set correctly. And with a night scene like this, it can be really difficult because I have some street lights and then I have some distant lights. I've got cars passing by. So I need to be really careful about how I'm doing this. If I set my exposure too low or my shutter speed is really, really slow, then I might overexpose the shot. I might have city lights or street lights really, really bright in the scene, and I don't want that. If I have the shutter speed too fast, then it's going to be too dark. So in a scene like this, setting the right exposure can be a little bit challenging. And sometimes it takes trial and error. Sometimes you can rely on the camera meter and it will tell you the right settings, and that could be your good starting point. Or other times you literally have to take a picture, see what it looks like, zoom in, make sure that everything as far as exposure is concerned is good, that nothing is too blown out and the sky looks okay. So another consideration is white balance. And if I let this camera do the auto white balance, it results in everything being really yellow and the background looks kind of weird. So what I did was I actually set the camera white balance to the lowest, which is 2500 on this camera, and that made the sky look blue and the foreground is not as bad. It's not as yellow. Next is the exposure. So in terms of the exposure itself, like I said, it can be really tricky. That's why I'm not going to shoot in aperture priority, shutter priority, or the program mode, or any of the auto modes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to manual. In manual mode, I've got full control of shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. And what I want to do is I want to set up my exposure so that my ISO is at the lowest setting. I'm shooting on a tripod. I don't need to be at high ISO. So the first thing I do is set my ISO to 100, and that's what I have on this camera. All right, next we have aperture. Now I started out at 5.6, but when I looked at the exposure length, my shutter speed was right around 6 seconds. With 6 seconds, it's long enough of shutter speeds for some movement, but with the car stopping and going, I wanted to have a longer shutter speed to introduce those trails in the shot so that it kind of looks neat, and I wanted to have a longer exposure. To achieve that, I had to stop down. So I had to go from 5.6 to f11 by 2 stops. Now doing that increased my shutter speed, so now I'm not at 6 seconds, I was close to about 20 seconds. At 20 seconds you can see there's all the trails in the cars, so it's looking nice. Another consideration is you don't want to stop down too much, because when you stop down too much you're going to damage image quality, and that's through diffraction. It's not a topic we're going to discuss today, but you can look it up. There's a lot of information online on diffraction. Next is shutter speed. Now I already talked about my exposure length, so I wanted to have that longer shutter speed. So obviously my aperture was driven by the longer shutter speed. Now you can also use filters to slow down your shutter speed. So if you see that 20 or 30 seconds is not enough, you could actually use a remote camera trigger and use a filter to reduce the amount of light that enters your camera and thus have 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 minute shutter speed. So that could be a really long exposure if you're looking for that effect. However, with filters, keep in mind that it's another piece of glass in front of your lens. If you don't have a really high quality filter, you might end up with all kinds of flare and other artifacts in your images. Now, what's more important than your exposure is focusing. In a night scene like this, it can be really tough to properly acquire focus. Sometimes you'll have front focused or back focused images and it's just going to look blurry. So the best way to achieve proper focus is to use live view in these cameras. A lot of these DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, they have the ability for you to see everything through the back of the LCD. So switch to live view mode or just turn on the camera on the mirrorless and make sure that it's displaying everything in the back. Then switch to manual focus and just manually zoom in all the way to 100%, look at the distant subject that you're focusing on and just make sure that it appears sharp. Once you do that, make sure that you're not switching back to autofocus. So keep it at manual. If you have a lens that has a switch from autofocus to manual, just switch it permanently to manual. That way, when you're triggering the shot, you're not forcing the camera to reacquire focus. So that's important, make sure you do that. On these mirrorless cameras, another neat feature is focus peaking. So if you are not sure about how good focus is, you can turn focus peaking on, and zooming in, you can actually see how it starts changing in color. You could set the focus peaking color to white, red, or some other color, and you will see right away when the image is in perfect focus. All right, so I've got my camera set up, my exposure is good, I already tested it, I've got my focus set up, so let's take a shot. I'm going to go ahead and turn it on, make sure that I am in timer, and as you can see I've got 2-second timer set. Everything's good. Let's go ahead and take a shot. All right, so as you can see, the camera started the exposure and you didn't hear the shutter, and the reason why is because of that electronic front curtain shutter that I talked about earlier. So what happens is when that timer ends, the camera is already has the sensor exposed and it just starts the exposure, and at the very end of the exposure, that's when it ended. You could hear the shutter. The nice thing is there's no camera shake as it happens. So let's review real quick. Image looks good, everything looks good. We're good to go. All right, to recap, use a tripod, set your camera on the tripod, work on your composition first, set everything up, then next, make sure that you're in manual focusing mode, focus on the distant subject, make sure to appear sharp, zoom in all the way, then set your camera to manual mode and test out your exposure. Take a few shots, just see how it looks. So for my scene right here, f11 at about 20 seconds worked out great. Make sure to set your ISO to 100, to the lowest setting that you have in the camera, and turn auto ISO off. Because if you have it turned on, the camera will try to push ISO higher and you will end up with noisy images. There is no need for that in a scene like this, especially because you're shooting off of a tripod. One more thing to look at is vibration reduction or image stabilization. In the beginning, when I just started taking pictures, some of the shots came out okay and others were blurry. And I couldn't understand why. And first I thought, well, I'm in San Francisco, I probably have earthquakes here happening right now, but I couldn't feel anything. So it was weird that some of the shots were okay and others were blurry. And then I figured it out. Image stabilization was turned on. Now this camera has in-body image stabilization, so it was turned on, and that's what was shaking the image and making it appear blurry. So make sure that you turn off image stabilization. If you have a lens that has a VR or IS setting on it, just turn it off. And if you have a camera body that has image stabilization, you want to turn it off whenever you use it on a tripod. One more thing, if you are capturing a scene like this and portion of the scene appears overexposed, although the rest of the exposure looks good, what you might want to do is take a few shots. So take one shot that exposes for one part of the scene, and then take another shot, or maybe multiple shots that expose for the bright part of the scene. Then what you could do is take those images to post-processing and blend them together to have one even image. Lastly, make sure that you shoot in RAW, because in a setting like this, there's so many different light sources out there. You can see the front here has really, really yellow lights, just like the yellow lights that are shining on me. and then in the background, there's all kinds of other different light sources. So make sure that you shoot in RAW, because you could take that file and modify white balance to any setting. So if I wanted that sky to appear a little bit more blue, I could tweak it and I could drop it down and make it appear more cold. And the nice thing is I could actually paint part of the scene and change the white balance in the foreground so that it doesn't appear as yellow. So the background could look a little bit more blue, the foreground would be reduced yellow. In a scene like this, that's really, really important. So always make sure you shoot in RAW. What a gorgeous day to be in Yosemite National Park. I'm standing right next to the beautiful Merced River. I've got the super famous El Capitan to my right, those three peaks in my back, perfect reflection, no wind. It's a great opportunity for some landscape photography. So I want to capture those three peaks just because it's such a beautiful reflection. It's a perfect opportunity for a vertical shot, and I'm going to go ahead and capture that, and I want to show you exactly what I'm doing. When photographing landscapes, the very first thing I usually do is scout for some good spots. Now, you could be in a really beautiful location, but if the spot where you're shooting from is not particularly interesting, if the scene itself is not beautiful, or maybe there's something obstructing the view, it will reflect that in your images. So the first thing I would recommend is to drive around, walk around, hike to some good spots where you can set up your camera and then start shooting. So to get to this particular spot, I had to park by the Cathedral Beach parking, and then I walked along the river to find this particular spot. And when I stopped right here, I saw a good opportunity, I saw a good reflection. I said to myself, this is going to be a good spot to not just shoot today, but also to come back maybe tomorrow for the sunrise opportunity, or maybe tomorrow evening for the sunset opportunities. So for me, this is going to be a great place to bookmark. I'm actually going to mark it on my map, maybe write down exactly how I got here so that I could come back for those sunrise and sunset opportunities. So once I identify a good spot like this, the next thing I'm going to do is determine whether it's good for sunrise or sunset opportunities, because the most color that you're going to get, that richness of color and a beautiful landscape, is going to show itself during those peak hours at sunrise or sunset. Now, for this particular location, I know that the sun is setting right in front of me, and it's about 3 o'clock right now, so I have a few hours left before the sunset. So if the sun is going to set right there and it's shining right at the mountain right now, once it's at the horizon, if the horizon itself is clear without any clouds, I might get some of that pink hitting my clouds, and I might get really, really beautiful scenery here to capture. Now, if you're not certain where the sun is going to set or where it's going to rise from, the best thing to do is to use an app. On my iPhone, I have a great app that allows me to see exactly where the sun is going to set, where it's going to rise, and looking at a location like this, I know exactly if it's going to be a good spot for that sunrise or sunset, or perhaps both. Now that I know that this particular location could be great for sunset tonight, I might stick around. But for now, I want to take some safe shots. So the sun is shining right at those peaks right now. I've got a gorgeous reflection. I want to capture that. But where do I start? What do I do? Let's talk about that. Now, in my hands right here, I've got the Canon 7D Mark II with the EFS 17 to 55mm 2.8 lens. Before I talk about what settings I'm using on the camera and what I'm going to do to capture this particular scene, let me first explain why I'm hand holding it. As you can see, there's no tripod, and the reason why I'm doing that is because there's plenty of light. Now, if I were doing panoramas, or perhaps if I were doing HDR, then I would have it mounted on a tripod. But since my purpose is to just capture the scene right now as is, I'm going to use the camera handheld. Now, I wrote an article on how to use a tripod, and you're welcome to read it, but one of the most important things that I've highlighted in the article is that a lot of people, unfortunately, set up their camera on their tripod and it becomes a limitation. The reason why it's a limitation is because their tripods are forcing them to one particular composition. maybe, and they're looking at their eye level. So what I usually do before I even set up my camera on the tripod, I walk around once I identify a good spot like this, I walk around, I see the angles, I look, maybe I want to include something in the foreground. Maybe there's something more interesting than just capturing the reflection. So I'm going to walk around with my camera, first look at the scene and then see, well, is it going to be a vertical shot? Is it going to be a horizontal shot? And then maybe, do I want to include something in the foreground or not? So those are the decisions that I have to make at the scene. And once I do that, only then I bring out the tripod, set it up. After I've done my framing, after I've taken a couple of shots, looked at them, and if I want to take it further, then I mount it on the tripod. So for this particular situation, we're not dealing with very little light. There's plenty of light, so my shutter speed is pretty high, and I know that I can capture this handheld. Also, what helps is this lens in particular has an image stabilizer. So if I turn it on, then it provides me additional ability to hand hold the camera without introducing camera shake. So now let's talk about the framing and what I'm going to do here. So next we have framing and composition, and those are also key elements. Before I worry about my f-stop, my ISO, my shutter speed, I need to first determine what I'm going to do with a particular scene. Also, I need to understand the limitations of my gear. So if I'm shooting with a 17 to 55 millimeter lens right here, when I try to compose the scene horizontally, I could barely fit the tip of the mountain on top of the frame. And I couldn't even get the reflection perfectly as well. So knowing that I want to compose the shot with a mirror reflection, mirror meaning right split in the middle, where the reflection is showing exactly what I'm seeing on the top of the frame, I know that I can't fit it horizontally. So I either need to move back, and if I move back, then I'm including all this junk in the scene right here, which I don't want. And the second option is to use a wider lens. Well, unfortunately, I don't have a wider lens, so I'm forced to this perspective. So at 17 millimeters, horizontal is not going to work. That's a physical limitation of my lens and my camera gear right here. Now, if I do a vertical composition, it works perfectly fine. So I went ahead and I zoomed in roughly to 20 millimeters, and I could get the whole frame covered, and I don't get a lot of junk here in the foreground. It looks great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to capture this vertically. And I actually walked around earlier. I looked at everything around here. I couldn't find anything interesting in the foreground to include that in the frame. I usually love doing that. Now for mirror reflection, it's not necessary. So if my goal is to capture just that, just to show it, in fact, something in the foreground might hurt the image, because the idea is to show that perfect 50-50 mirror. Right, so right here, I'm going to go ahead and capture it without anything in the foreground. And let's now talk about the camera settings. As I'm setting up my camera for this shot, the very first thing I'm going to do is set my camera mode. I'm going to go ahead and set it to aperture priority mode, just because that's what I normally do when going handheld. I'll let the camera deal with the shutter speed while I take charge of the aperture and ISO. So my aperture is set to 5.6. Now in this particular setting, you can see I don't have anything in the foreground that I want to include in the frame. So I only worry about the reflection. And the nearest part of the reflection is pretty far from me. It's probably about 10 feet, maybe between 8 to 10 feet away from me. So I could literally shoot this at 2.8, and depth of field would be enough to capture everything when I focus at infinity. I don't have to worry about that. But the biggest issue and the reason why I don't want to shoot at 2.8 is because a lot of lenses are not very good at their widest aperture. So I want to set this to 5.6. Usually between 5.6 to f8 is a sweet spot of all lenses. So for this particular lens, I'm going to go ahead and set it to 5.6, and that's going to be my aperture. The next thing is ISO, and that setting is really important. I want to make sure that I'm not shooting at auto ISO. I don't want that ISO to fluctuate as the light levels change, and I want to set it to ISO 100. Now the reason why I want to do that is because if you remember from the previous discussions, the lower the ISO, the lower the noise, the greater the dynamic range. So in this case, by setting it to ISO 100, I'm going to get the least amount of noise and the greatest amount of dynamic range. So with all those three set up, and in camera mode set up to aperture priority mode, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at what my shutter speed is going to be calculated at. So let's take a look. At 5.6 ISO 100, my shutter speed is right around 1/60th of a second. Now that's what my camera is telling me. Let's go ahead and take a picture and see what it looks like. Now at 1/60th of a second, you can see the top of the mountain and the white clouds are completely blown out. Blown out means that there's no information left whatsoever. There's no way for us to be able to recover it. However, the middle scene is looking okay. So the camera clearly exposed properly for the middle of the scene where the evergreen and the dark area is, but the top portion is completely blown out. So 1/60th of a second is not enough for the shot. Clearly we need to be at a faster shutter speed so that we can actually capture a little bit more and maybe lose a little bit here in the darker area. Let's go ahead and override that. I'm going to use my exposure compensation setting here on the camera, and I'm going to dial it to -1. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and dial it to -2 because that looked pretty extreme. And let's see what happens now. At -2, now my shutter speed is right around 1/200th of a second. So at 1/200th of a second, now the exposure is looking much better. Now the darker area of the shot is looking pretty dark, but then I'm only blowing out just a little bit of that white in the cloud. And I'm fine with that. I'm fine with blowing out just a little bit of the white portion of the cloud as long as the sky is captured perfectly. It's looking nice and blue. And then the clouds are themselves really white. I don't need to preserve all the details in the clouds. So in a setting like this, when you deal with a sunrise, sunset situation, or perhaps you're dealing with a lot of shadow areas and really bright parts of the scene, what you might want to do is use filters. Let's talk about that next. There are all kinds of filters out there, but the one that works really well for this particular scene is called a graduated neutral density filter, and that's exactly what I have in my hand right here. Now, the graduated neutral density filter, the reason why it's so effective is because, as you can see on the bottom of the filter, it's pretty clear, and then it gradually transitions over to dark. Now, this one is a 0.9, which means it's about 3 stops of difference between the darkest area of the frame to the brightest area of the frame. And the difference before, when I was taking a shot at 1/60th of a second, you saw that it was really bright and I had to compensate my exposure by about 2 stops to make the sky look right. But when I did that, the middle section of the frame is where I got a lot of shadows or a lot of dark areas. So what I want to do is I want to use this filter. When I use the filter and put it in front of my lens, what's going to happen is that that top portion of the frame where I was getting a lot of light now is being blocked by the filter. And the middle portion of the frame is where I'm going to put the transition area. And then towards the bottom of the frame and where I was getting a lot of the shadows is where is going to be the clear area of the filter. So let's take one more shot and let's see what happens with the filter in my hand. I'm going to compose it the same way, put it, and then I'm going to move the filter a little bit just to see where I need to put that transition line, and we'll see what the impact is going to be of the filter. So let's take a shot. I'm going to do the same thing, just vertically compose, move this a little bit, and take a shot. Now, I'm back to 1/60th of a second. I'm not shooting at 200th of a second anymore just because I want to go back and have proper exposure for the middle of the frame. And by going to 1/60th of a second, I'm actually now exposing the middle part of the frame very well. But as you can see, now the top portion of the frame is not getting blown out as much. I'm still getting a little bit of highlights lost in the clouds, but the clouds are white. It's perfectly fine with me. I'm not worried about that. But the filter has a huge impact on the overall look of the scene. I have now a much more balanced exposure. It doesn't look fake that I used a filter because it's a graduated filter. It gradually moves over from the clear to the dark area, so it looks much better. Whenever you're dealing with situations like this, where you have a portion of the scene really bright, and the other portion of the scene is coming out much darker, use filters like this because they will help you get it right in the camera. All right, so we're approaching sunset time and it's getting much darker. I'm no longer comfortable hand holding the camera just because I'm dealing with much slower shutter speeds, and I'm definitely not comfortable anymore to hand hold this filter in front of that lens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mount the camera on a tripod, and then I'm going to use a filter holder in front of this lens so that I can slide this filter in. And the reason why I still want to use the filter is because when the sun hits the horizon and it's really close, hopefully we'll get some color in those clouds. The clouds are going to be much brighter than the rest of the scene. So this filter will allow me to block some of that light and hopefully balance out the exposure. Let's see what happens. Let's take some pictures. So here I've got the camera set up on the tripod. I've got the filter holder in place and the filter, as you can see. And the interesting thing to note here is that the filter is actually slightly tilted to the right. And the reason why I had to do that was because I was getting a lot more of that pink in the clouds to the right side of the three peaks or the three brothers. That's why I had to do that. So keep this in mind when using these filter holders. They're really nice and allow you for all that flexibility. Now, I actually slid it out just a little bit because I didn't want the dark side to hit the side of the mountain. So I only was interested in using the filter for the sky. So just keep this in mind and do it right in the camera.